The studio was buzzing. Lights were flashing. The crowd clapped in rhythm as the cameras rolled. It was another night of late-night television. The jokes, the banter, the laughter, everything seemed ordinary. But behind the curtain sat someone who was not ordinary at all. He sat quietly in a chair, hands resting on his lap. He was not scrolling through his phone. He was not rehearsing one-liners. He simply breathed, his eyes calm, as if his mind was in another place. When a studio assistant approached him nervously and said, "Sir, you're on in 3 minutes," he looked up, smiled gently, and nodded. "Thank you." There was something peaceful in that smile, something that stood out in a world filled with constant noise. He wasn't trying to impress. He wasn't trying to dominate. He was just present. The host stepped onto the stage wearing his usual grin. The audience roared, the cameras zoomed, and the energy filled the room. Everyone expected a night of jokes and entertainment. But none of them knew. Tonight would be remembered for something very different. The host leaned forward, setting the stage. "Ladies and gentlemen, our guest tonight is one of Hollywood's most loved men. He has fought agents in the Matrix, fought assassins as John Wick, and yet somehow he remains the most humble man in Hollywood. Please welcome!" The applause thundered as the guest walked out. A small wave, a nod. Then he sat quietly across from the host. Their handshake lingered, almost as if the host wanted to test him. "Always good to have you here," the host said. "You're like the internet's favorite saint. You ride the subway, you help strangers, you don't seem to age. What's your secret? Immortality? Meditation?" The crowd laughed. The guest smiled faintly. "No secret," he said softly. "Just living with less noise." That sentence landed gently, but with weight. The audience leaned in. Not because he shouted, but because he didn't need to. But the host wasn't satisfied. He pressed further. "So, you've spoken of faith before, forgiveness, karma, God. Hollywood usually doesn't like that. Isn't it a little unusual?" A mix of chuckles rippled through the crowd, but some faces grew still. The guest paused. "Faith isn't loud," he said. "It's not about converting anyone. It's simply something I carry, like a compass." His voice was calm, steady, but it felt different, as if truth was walking into the room. The host's smile remained, but his eyes narrowed. Producers whispered in his earpiece, "Push him. Ask the tough question." And then the storm began. The host leaned closer. His grin looked the same, but there was something sharp behind it. Maybe it was for ratings. Maybe it was personal. But the next question wasn't lighthearted at all. He asked, "If you believe in God, then where was he when you lost your loved ones? Where was he when your sister was so sick? You've been through pain most of us cannot imagine. How does someone still believe?" The studio froze. The laughter stopped. For a moment, it was as if the cameras weren't even there. The guest blinked once. Then again. He didn't frown. He didn't defend himself in anger. He simply sat still, his hands resting calmly on his knees. Then he spoke softly. "I don't think God is a vending machine," he said. "You don't put in suffering and expect candy in return. Silence." Deep silence. The kind you could feel in your chest. The host shifted, uncomfortable. "But don't you think it's naive to believe in something when the world is so full of chaos?" The guest looked down for a moment, then raised his head. His voice was steady. "Maybe faith isn't about avoiding pain. Maybe it's what helps you walk through it, without becoming bitter. No applause. No laughter. Just stillness." The crowd didn't know how to react. This wasn't a punchline. This wasn't scripted. This was raw truth, spoken gently, yet cutting through the room like a quiet wind. The host tried to chuckle, brushing it off. "You're making this too serious for my show, buddy." The guest smiled faintly. "I didn't come here to be shallow." And that was it. One soft line, but sharp as glass. Not rude, not proud, but clear. A gentle boundary laid down for the world to see. Backstage, producers scrambled. Some whispered to cut to commercial. Others said let it play. The host waved them off. He wanted more. "So tell me," the host continued, "you work in Hollywood, A place obsessed with image, not faith. Isn't it hypocritical? The guest leaned back, calm as ever. Maybe. Or maybe that's why it needs more people willing to be honest. A few hands clapped in the audience. Not many, but enough to be noticed. The host sighed. His smile faded. "We'll be right back." The screen cut to black. But something had already shifted. When the cameras stopped rolling, the guest stood up quietly. He didn't shout. He didn't storm off. He simply chose not to play along anymore. He skipped the post-show interview, skipped the green room chatter, picked up his jacket, and walked toward the door. At the exit, he nodded politely to the security guard. "Thank you," he said softly, and then he was gone. By morning, the internet was on fire. Actor storms off late-night show. Faith feud goes viral. Colbert versus the quiet man. Clips spread across TikTok, YouTube, and social media. The one line that repeated everywhere was, "I didn't come here to be shallow." Some praised him. Finally, someone who refuses to play along with fake TV. This is real strength. Calm, not anger. Others criticized him. Why go to a talk show if you're just going to act serious? He needs to lighten up. It's entertainment, not therapy. News outlets twisted the story into whatever headlines sold the most clicks. But the man himself? He said nothing. In his simple apartment, he sat by the window. The morning sun spilled onto the floor. A mug of tea sat untouched. His phone buzzed with messages, but he didn't pick it up. "They see headlines," he whispered to himself, "but they don't see hearts." The guest's silence spoke louder than any press statement could. He didn't post on social media. He didn't call a press conference. He simply carried on with life, but the world would not let it rest. Some people argued endlessly online. Others replayed the clip again and again. Headlines kept twisting the moment. Some called it a meltdown. Others called it a faith fight. But those who watched closely saw something very different. They saw calmness where most would have exploded. Meanwhile, the man himself chose peace. He visited children in a hospital, reading them stories and holding their hands. He smiled gently when a nurse whispered, "You didn't deserve that treatment." He simply replied, "It's all right." They needed a moment. I needed peace. That was who he was. He didn't fight with noise. He fought with presence. Back at the late-night studio, something unusual happened. A young assistant producer called the guest's manager. Her voice shook as she left a message. "I just wanted to say, I watched the interview again, and I think what he said was beautiful. I've never seen someone stay that calm under pressure. Please tell him, some of us noticed. And we're sorry," the message was passed on. He didn't respond. But for the first time that day, he smiled gently. Sometimes healing begins with the smallest voices. Days later, he received an invitation from a different show. But this time, there would be no flashy stage, no roaring audience. Just a small table, 2 chairs, and a young interviewer known for her kindness. He agreed. Not because he wanted to defend himself, but because he wanted to bring clarity. The interviewer began softly. "You didn't want to talk after the last show. Why did you say yes to this?" He paused, then said, "Because silence is only powerful if people understand it. And sometimes they need help understanding. Were you hurt?" she asked. "No," he answered calmly. "Just disappointed. Not in the host, but in how quickly people turn depth into drama." The interview was short, real, and gentle. No games, no tricks, just truth. Viewers flooded the comments. "I never knew he was this deep. This is what public conversation should look like. This man speaks like he meditates through fire." The clip spread across the internet, but this time, not for drama. This time, for reflection. Soon after, he was offered a contract by a giant streaming company. Millions of dollars, full creative control. At least that's what they promised. But as he read through the pages, he saw the hidden clause. All content must align with company values and be subject to editorial approval. He closed the folder quietly. "I thought you said full freedom." The executives shuffled uncomfortably. "Well, we just mean Nothing too risky. You can talk about anything, as long as it doesn't make people uncomfortable. He smiled faintly. So I can speak, but only if I don't speak too honestly. They had no answer. He set the folder aside. Truth with conditions isn't truth, and once again, he walked away. Not because he didn't care about money, but because no amount of applause or wealth was worth his soul. Word spread quickly. He turned down millions. He walked away from the deal of a lifetime, but to him, it wasn't about deals. It wasn't about fame. It was about keeping his heart unchained. A pastor wrote online, "Not all heroes wear capes. Some simply refuse to sell their soul." A young filmmaker tweeted, "He turned down what I dream of, but somehow it makes me respect him even more." And ordinary people on the street called out to him, "You're the guy who didn't sell out, right?" He would just smile and nod because he wasn't chasing praise. He was simply standing still and still being heard. Weeks later, the man received an invitation. It wasn't for a movie premiere. It wasn't for a flashy red carpet. It was for something far quieter, a private award ceremony hosted by an independent film academy. They wanted to honor him, not for his roles in films, but for something far deeper. For showing the world that silence can be stronger than noise, that truth can outlast applause. The room was small, filled with filmmakers, students, journalists, and critics. Even the late-night host who had once pressed him too hard was there, sitting quietly, looking different this time, softer, humbled. When the award was announced, the man walked to the stage. He didn't raise his arms. He didn't pause for applause. He simply stood at the podium, the crystal award in his hand. He began slowly, his voice calm and low. "I don't take many stages. And when I do, I usually let my characters do the talking. But this time it isn't about characters. It's about us. About who we choose to be when the cameras aren't rolling." He paused, letting the room breathe. "People keep asking why I walked away that night. Why I turned down millions. Why I stayed silent when I was criticized. And the answer is simple. I'm not afraid to lose things that were never mine to keep." The room was still. Fame is a reflection. Money is a tool. But integrity, and that's yours. And when you give it away, you can't buy it back. Tears welled in the eyes of a few listeners. Some nodded quietly. Everyone listened. No phones, no chatter. Just presence. The man closed by saying, "In a world that rewards noise, sometimes silence is the loudest truth. And in a culture that applauds performance, presence is the greater gift. Thank you for hearing the quiet." The applause that followed wasn't thunderous. It was steady, warm, and real. Later that evening, a young boy stopped him on the street. "Hey, aren't you the guy who didn't yell back?" The man smiled. "Yes, I guess that's me." "My dad said you're a real man," the boy said proudly. The man bent down, looked him in the eye, and said, "Being real is just being kind when no one's looking. Remember that, okay?" The boy nodded, hopped on his bike, and rode away. And just like that, the story came full circle. Because sometimes the strongest example is not the speech you give in front of millions. It's the quiet way you carry yourself when nobody is watching. If this story touched you, share it with someone who needs to be reminded of the power of quiet strength. And don't forget to subscribe. More stories like this are waiting to bring light into your day.